VisiSonic, the heart of your system.
Alright guys, Dominic here for KitGuru, and today we are back with another RTX card. This one is from Asus ROG and it's the RTX 2080 Ti Strix OC. So we've actually already reviewed the Strix 2080, and so if you've seen that review, these cards are actually very similar, aside from the fact they've got different GPUs. The actual design of the card and the features is very similar. That means this card does have a factory overclock as well. Out of the box it will run at 1650 MHz, although we did test it at 1665 MHz, because you can add an extra 15 MHz if you download GPU Tweak 2 and enable the OC mode. But of course we're going to get to performance and all that later on in the review. We're going to dive in with a look at the design first, and as far as I can tell, the coolers between the Strix 2080 and the 2080 Ti are exactly the same. So what that means is you are getting a big card. It actually measures 30.47 centimeters by 13.04 by 15.41 centimeters. So that thickness actually makes it a 2.7 slot card. So, and though I feel like I say this in almost every graphics card review we do now, it's definitely worth making sure this will fit in your case. The overall look of the Strix 2080 Ti is again similar to the 2080. You've got the matte black plastic shroud, which, although it's made of plastic, actually does feel quite sturdy. And again, you've got the kind of angled, almost slightly aggressive look to the shroud, but again, I think that looks quite good. The three fans on the front as well are Asus's new Axial Tech fans. So compared to the previous generation, which was called Wingblade, these fan blades actually are much more swept in design, whereas the Wingblade fans were quite straight. And interestingly, there's actually a ring that goes around the outside of the fan blades now, so it's kind of enclosed, whereas the previous Wingblade fans were left open. Overall, Asus actually says the new design gives 27% increased airflow and up to 40% increased static pressure, and of course we're going to get to thermal performance later on in the review. Staying at the front of the shroud though, there is of course some RGB action here, and again this is exactly the same as it was with the Strix 2080. So on the front of the shroud we've actually got these 12 small RGB LED strips, and that is of course configurable by Asus Aura software, and then on the Asus ROG logo, the Republic of Gamers logo, on both the side of the card and on the backplate as well, those are also RGB zones. If we look on the front side of the card as well, here we can see the GeForce RTX logo printed quite subtly in this kind of grey colour, although moving on past that we can also see the two 8-pin power connectors, which interestingly enough is actually the same as with the Strix 2080, so they haven't upped it to maybe two 8-pins and one 6-pin for instance. It's still just the two 8-pins with the Strix 2080 Ti. On this front edge there is also a little switch accessible. This actually lets you choose between the two different BIOS options. You can have the performance BIOS or the quiet BIOS, which is exactly the same as with the Strix 2080. Interestingly enough, that doesn't actually change the clock speed depending on which one you're in. It's very much just the fan curve. So we're going to test out that later on, see how much of a difference it actually makes to performance, and of course our thermals and noise testing. Flipping the card over now gives us a look at the backplate, and it's a lovely brushed metal design. I really think it looks really good, and there is some silver accenting as well, while the Asus ROG logo at the end, as we mentioned, is one of those RGB zones. Just as with the Strix 2080, there is again a master switch for the RGB, so you just push this button and the RGB will turn on or off. We can also see at the end of the card there is actually a 4-pin RGB header that is accessible. So this simply lets you connect maybe an RGB strip or an RGB fan for instance. You can connect that to the graphics card itself, and then that will let you control that RGB peripheral using Asus Aura software. Funnily enough though, the Strix 2080 actually had two 4-pin PWM fan headers here as well, and these seem to be missing from the Strix 2080, and personally I think that is a slight disappointment. I quite like the feature of being able to control maybe your two intake fans at the front of your case via the graphics card, so when the graphics card gets hot you get more fresh air depending on the temperature of the graphics card, not your CPU, but that feature does not seem to be here on the 2080 Ti. What is still here on the 2080 Ti, however, is actually the graphics card fan's ugly multicolour header. You can see it sticks out right at the end of the card. It's actually very visible, and considering this card actually costs £1,500, 1.5 grand, to have this same ugly multicolour cable I think is just ridiculous. Asus genuinely thinks you're going to drop 1.5 grand on a card like this, which doesn't even have a sleeve cable or all black cables. It's just, It just looks really lazy. I think it makes Asus look quite bad. It's not really a major point, it doesn't really affect much other than the visuals, but as again, when you're spending this much money, it just makes Asus look bad, the fact that they haven't gone with a sleeved cable. Just before moving on as well, it is worth mentioning the front I/O. This has been changed slightly over reference, so we have 2 HDMI ports instead of just one, and then there's 2 display ports as well as the 1 USB-C. Moving on though to look at the inside of the card, to take off the heatsink you simply need to remove 6 screws from the back of the card and then the PCB will come free. We can actually see there's still a metal frame stuck onto the PCB. This screws into the back plate, and essentially this gives you structural rigidity to prevent any sagging from the card once it's in the PCIe slot, and it also acts as a heatsink for the VRAM chips as it makes direct contact with those chips. Once that is off, we get a proper look at the PCB, and the main thing here being that Asus has gone with 16+3 power phases, which is up from 13+3 of the Founders Edition, while we can also see that the 11GB of GDDR6 memory is from Micron, while our TU102 GPU is labelled TU102-300A, and as we know, the A signifies that this is a bin chip which is suitable to be sold with a factory overclock. The heatsink itself is quite a hefty unit. It's the same as the Strix 2080, so it uses 6 nickel-plated copper heat pipes, while the GPU itself contacts with this cold plate which uses Asus Max technology. So essentially, according to Asus, this is up to 10 times flatter than traditional heat spreaders, and that, as the name suggests, gives you greater thermal contact and thus greater thermal transfer. Moving on to performance now, as we mentioned, we did run the card with OC mode enabled within Asus GPU Tweak 2, so that runs the boost clock at 1665 MHz compared to the 1650 MHz that you get out of the box without any software. We did as well test both of the BIOS options, both performance and quiet BIOS, to see what difference that makes, both in terms of our games and also when it comes to thermals, noise levels and power consumption. So starting with our 3D Mark benchmarks and our games, the first thing you can really see is, of course, the Strix is faster than the 2080 Ti Founders Edition from Nvidia. At 4K, we actually saw it between 2 to 5 FPS faster, so the margins aren't massive, but they are definitely there. And interestingly, we actually saw the quiet BIOS performing only marginally behind the performance BIOS, so you really don't lose that much performance, and as we will get to shortly, it is significantly quieter, so that is definitely a benefit. Looking at the average clock speed under load as well, we can see that the Strix card in performance mode ran around 120 MHz faster than Nvidia's Founders Edition, so of course that does explain the performance benefits we saw from the Strix card. The quiet BIOS though is only around 30 MHz slower than the performance BIOS, so you really don't lose much in terms of performance, as we already mentioned when looking at our game benchmarks. What you do get from the quiet BIOS though is slightly warmer GPU temperatures. It actually peaks at 72 degrees using the quiet BIOS, which, while it's definitely a bit warmer than other aftermarket RTX cards we've seen, is still actually the same as the Nvidia Founders Edition, so again, it's actually a pretty good result considering the low noise levels that we'll get onto in a moment. Using performance BIOS though, we saw the GPU peak at just 59 degrees, which is actually the coolest result we've seen from any aftermarket RTX card so far. So with the performance BIOS engaged, it is certainly very, very cool. Because of that, we do get slightly louder noise levels when using the performance BIOS, so we saw it peak at just over 43 decibels. Some of the other aftermarket cards we've seen have been closer to 40, but if you really do want very, very low noise levels, go for the quiet BIOS. It peaked at just over 39 decibels, and honestly, I really couldn't hear it. I had to push my ear right up against the card on the test bench to actually hear that the fans were spinning. Considering the quiet BIOS barely runs any slower, yet it is significantly quieter, I have to say this dual BIOS functionality is definitely the most impressive feature of the Strix 2080 Ti. Moving on now to power consumption, just a reminder that we do have dedicated sensors in both the PCIe slot as well as the PCI power connectors, and that lets us measure the power consumption of the graphics card only, not the system as a whole. So with that being said, both BIOS barely made any difference, so the card drew just over 300 watts regardless of BIOS. That's quite a lot, to be honest. It's getting up there. It's only 10 or 11 watts behind Vega 64, but it is of course worth bearing in mind that the 2080 Ti does give you significantly more performance, and if you're spending this much money on a single card, the extra power consumption probably isn't going to bother you that much. It's also worth touching on our manual overclock, and we actually did quite well with this Strix 2080 Ti. We were able to add an extra 145 MHz to the GPU core and 700 MHz to the GDDR6 memory. So this actually brought our average clock speed up to 1968 MHz, so we weren't quite at that 2 GHz mark, but we came close, and this actually pushed up our Firestrike score by over 2,500 points, which I thought was particularly impressive, and we saw between an extra 3 to 5 FPS when playing Deus Ex or Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 4K resolution. The GPU did run a bit hotter when we had our overclock. It rose by 4 degrees, but that still only brought it up to 63C, which is again very cool and still one of the best results we've seen from our aftermarket RTX card, though noise levels did rise as well by an extra decibel, bringing it just over 44 dB. Power consumption did also rise by around 30 watts, bringing it past Vega 64 to around the 330 watt mark, although again, as we mentioned, if you're spending £1,500 on a graphics card, I don't think it's really going to bother you. So in total, as we would expect, considering we've already looked at the Strix 2080, the Strix 2080 Ti is a fantastic card. Not only is it fast, it's got some good features as well, and using the quiet BIOS, it is essentially dead silent. The question is, at £1,500, is this really worth the extra £400 over Nvidia's Founders Edition? Speaking purely in terms of value, no, I don't think you would pay an extra £400 for the extra 2 or 5 FPS at 4K that you get from this Strix 2080 Ti over Nvidia's Founders Edition. But the thing is, and I'm sure many people are going to disagree with me here, but I really don't think you can look at 2080 Ti in terms of its value. To me, it's definitely not a value proposition. 2080 Ti at over £1,000 regardless of which card you go for. It's a card for those who just want the absolute best and aren't fussed about how much money they're going to spend in the process. So yes, of course, the Strix is very expensive. It's £1,500, you know, only, you know, the most elite of gamers is going to be able to afford this card. But the thing is, if you do want the absolute best, you're already going to be spending £1,100 on a Nvidia's Founders Edition 2080 Ti if it is the 2080 Ti you want. So if you're already spending that much money, is the extra £400 going to mean that much to you? Personally, I don't think so. So if you are looking at the 2080 Ti, I really think the Strix 2080 Ti probably isn't as big a stretch as it might have been if you were looking at either the Founders 2080 or the Strix 2080. If we looked at that use case, the Strix 2080 was simply priced way too close to Nvidia's Founders 2080 Ti to make any sense. The Strix 2080 Ti, however, is up there on its own. There's nothing past it, on the consumer level at least, that gives you the same amount of performance. So, like I said, while it's not a value proposition, if you do want the absolute best, the absolutely fastest card, and considering the dual BIOS functionality, you get both the performance and the silence from the Strix 2080 Ti, I definitely think it is worth something looking at. It's definitely a very, very good card, but of course you do have to pay for the privilege. So I'm Dominic 4Kit Guru. This has been our review of the Strix 2080 Ti. Please do let me know in the comments what you think. If you disagree with me wholeheartedly, let me know why. My opinion is that you don't look at this card as a value proposition. Instead, it's for those who are going to spend a lot of money regardless and they just want the best of the best. But please feel free to disagree with me down below in the comments. You can also subscribe to make sure you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. We've still got plenty more RTX coverage to come, and be sure to hit that little bell icon to be notified about all of our upcoming videos. Until then though, I will see you in the next video.